El doctor Tony Capstick, de la Universidad de Reading, nos va a presentar el resultado de la investigación que terminó en el informe de Language for Resilience.
Yes, my name is Tony. I am one of the co-authors of the Language for Resilience report, which you have copies of. And I'm going to be talking about the research that we did, myself and Mari Delaney, and trying to pick up where Mike left off with some of the issues and concepts around resilience and how they link to what we already know about language. I am a sociolinguist, so I'm interested in the relationship between language, identity, and society, and applying what we know about multilingualism to the kind of complex, diverse settings that we found ourselves in when we visited the Middle East. So to start here, to sort of pick up the threads of Mike's earlier talk, we're looking at resilience on these three levels: the individual, the household, and the community level. So the review of the literature showed us that there's a lot of work already exists, but mainly in cross-cultural psychology. So trying to understand the protective, but also the vulnerability factors that are related to this ability to withstand and recover and bounce back from adversity. So what we wanted to identify was what is the relationship between these ideas about resilience and where language fits in. So as you can see from this, it's quite a broad concept. If you look at this, which is a sort of slightly later definition, it's more interventionist. It uses the term intervention when looking at how we bolster or enhance the existing resilience of displaced people. So the previous understanding was trying to look at how we can enhance resilience more broadly with people that are already resilient. They've already managed to find themselves in new contexts and having sort of fled all sorts of different kinds of conflict or environmental disaster. And here there's this idea that you can actually intervene and enhance that existing resilience. So what we wanted to do was to find out how language fits in. So some of the key terms, which I will try to highlight as I go through my talk, are these protective processes. How does language enable the kinds of bolstering of that resilience? And how can language also be a barrier? And in what contexts is language a barrier for that? So we're looking at positive outcomes. Now, when we looked at the literature, we found that there was quite a lot of overlap between the idea of resilience being something that people sort of have as an attribute, as a characteristic of their personality, but also this idea that it's also a dynamic process. So it's, as Mike pointed out, it's in that sort of dynamic relationship with what people do as an individual, with family members, but also with the wider community. So what I'll try to do when I focus on the 5 key principles that we identified is highlight that overlap between the individual, the community, and the institutional levels. And as I said before, sort of trying to bring out what are these protective factors and what are the vulnerability factors. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a sociolinguist, so I come with a particular view of the world, which is that all of us draw on a whole range of different language resources to fulfill whatever kind of communicative purpose it is that is required. So whether we see ourselves as monolingual or whether we see ourselves as very multilingual, we're constantly shifting and drawing on a range of different resources, different registers, different genre, to fit the particular needs. And that's the kind of approach that we took when we were looking at the kind of multilingual repertoires, the kind of range of resources that people talk to us about. So I will draw on a little bit of research that we already know about, and that is not just looking at language as a set of competencies, but also trying to look at how language is distributed, how some people have access to certain languages and don't have access to others. So we want to try to understand language for resilience within that social context. Clearly, access to Spanish, as we've heard about today, or access to English, or access to other dominant languages, doesn't happen in a vacuum and can only enable us to access other social resources given certain contextual factors. So it's by looking at how language is distributed in particular communities that we can start to actually build language programs that then give people the kind of access to certain resources that are required. And the point that I want to highlight here is that, again, it's not necessarily looking at acquisition. It's not only looking at language programs as interventions, but we also try to look at what people were already doing. So yes, we were interested in talking to teachers and educational planners about what they were doing in classrooms and what they were doing in teacher education colleges. But we were also looking at what ordinary, everyday people were telling us about their everyday language practices, based on this idea that people were already resilient, so they're already using their languages strategically. So we wanted to find out a little bit about what that meant as well. So this is just one of the settings. And as you can see, in resource-low environments, in poor environments such as these, clearly there are going to be all sorts of barriers to, not only to the kinds of language programs that we've heard about today, but also about how families then have access to other resources. So this was our overarching research question. It changed as we went along, as we reformulated this particular question. But what we wanted to find out through our visits to the 4 countries was what are the protective factors that enhance and the vulnerability factors which constrain refugees and internally displaced people's resilience. So as you can see, most of the research was carried out across the winter 2015, 2016. We spent between 2 and 3 weeks in each of those 4 countries, the 4 countries neighbouring Syria. So this was where the majority of Syrian refugees had been dispersed to, had been displaced to. But as I point out here, we were interested in talking to far more different kinds of groups than merely the refugee communities. We also wanted to look at teachers, teacher coordinators, school principals in home and host communities. We also wanted to look at internally displaced people. There were far more internally displaced people in the region than there were people who were cross-border refugees. So we also wanted to find out about their trajectories and how language fits into their movements. So we spoke to parents of the school-aged children that we interviewed. We looked at the formal and informal sectors. And we wanted to try to establish what were the similarities and the differences between the kind of provision that we were being told about. So we carried out lots of interviews, lots of face-to-face interviews. The great thing about working with the British Council was that they had access to all sorts of fascinating settings, camp settings, non-camp settings, NGO, UN, formal, non-formal. So I was able to do lots of lesson observations in all sorts of different environments. Now, obviously, there was all sorts of difficulties then and challenges about how you write up that kind of data collection. And I think it is important to say a little bit about how the findings that you'll see in the report, why they're framed the way that they're framed. And they're framed that way was because we really were taking a very qualitative approach. We wanted to know what people felt about their own language practices, or what they felt about the language practices of the people that they were working with, or the people that they were teaching. So it was a very qualitative type of study in that respect. And also, sort of, my background's in ethnography, so again, trying to look at the sort of cultural components or aspects of language use and keeping that language use within its cultural context, which also meant taking multiple perspectives. I don't think we were particularly fearful of recognizing that there was lots of different ways of looking at what people told us. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the sort of majority of the rest of the session, is how we then carved up, how we divided up all of this data that was very rich, but was obviously very complex. So it was a large data set. You can imagine we had dozens of interviews every day, dozens of lesson observations of all sorts of different age groups, different contexts. So we collated that, Mari, Delaney and myself, working with people at the British Council. We put all of that together, and we tried to look at patterns across the different data sets and across the different countries. We weren't trying to pin down a set of practices that occurred in Iraq, Kurdistan, that were somehow different to a set of practices that occurred in Lebanon. We really wanted to look at what were the common patterns across what people do. If resilience is operating at that individual and community level, then there's clearly going to be some kind of overlap in those practices. So it wasn't about saying that Arabic serves a specific function across all of those contexts, but really trying to look at how Arabic, for different kinds of Arabic speakers, will have different uses in different contexts. So it was quite a long, hard way of working with a lot of data, but we felt this was ultimately going to give us what we required, which was some overarching principles that weren't necessarily purely about the contexts that we went into, but could be sort of replicable across other contexts. And as I've said before, but I will mention it again, it wasn't looking at proficiency as such. It wasn't looking at language extracted as a set of systems and signs that are kind of the same across these different settings, but it was very much about what people do with all of the languages in their repertoire at particular stages of their trajectories or their journeys. Okay, so a little bit of audience participation now, as it's been a long day, and I'm conscious of the fact that you've had a huge amount of information presented to you. So these are the 5 principles that we identified. The first one is about home language and literacy development. So these really are the kinds of varieties that you will all be familiar with. They're the kind of, possibly more informal varieties of language that you will use with your husbands and wives and families and friends. Now, sometimes there will be world languages. There will be varieties of Spanish or Arabic, but they're slightly different to the very standard varieties that we identified in the second, where in order to get a school qualification or get through a degree program or enter an early childhood education program, you have to have a fairly standardized variety of that language. Home languages with that sort of slightly more blurred language use, where it's basically a language that is familiar to the learner, a language that they potentially, ideally, would be literate in. So the second one is more about access to education and qualifications in standard languages. As you will have noticed from there, named languages are missing. We didn't identify, as I said before, specific languages for specific contexts because we wanted these to be able to be understood and used in other settings. But this one would probably be, as an example, French or English. In order to access the Lebanese school curriculum, you would need to be able to speak French and English. The third one's much more about coming together with other people and the kind of language that we use in order to integrate or affiliate or cohere with other members of the community. No matter how long displaced people are staying in a community, clearly there is a need for them to be able to talk to their neighbours or buy goods or fill in visa application forms. So how do people use language to fit in alongside each other? The fourth one is a very clear and slightly more controversial principle in that it was trying to identify the role of language in dealing with trauma. So many of the people that we spoke to, many of the teachers that we spoke to, they would be like the frontline staff for people who'd been through quite traumatic events. Now, what we found was that people were using language learning interventions. They were using an Arabic literacy class or an English language lesson as a way, or as a vehicle for then introducing psychosocial support through that language learning intervention. So it's a very specific use of language learning, and often what we found was that there was a trade-off between how much language was being learned and how much psychosocial support was being provided. As far as I could work out, the psychosocial support was really the ultimate goal. And often languages such as English would be a sort of, a vehicle for that, a way of getting people into the classroom, getting them to sort of use new communicative ways of learning together. And the fifth one was, if you remember the three levels, individual, community, and institutional, in the fifth principle, we were trying to identify a role for language for resilience at that institutional level. And possibly because of who we were speaking to, most of the institutions were related to the provision of language education. So they were ministries of education, maybe ministries of social affairs, but they were the people who were ultimately responsible for training large numbers of teachers in the state sector. We also met lots of language educators in the non-formal and informal sectors. But certainly at this institutional level, we thought it was important to identify how to work with ministries. And again, drawing from what we already know and what we could already see was working in other collaborations with ministry, then how do we identify the role of language for resilience here? So what I'd like you to do for 2 minutes is to turn to the person sitting next to you, and in your pair or in your small group, if you could just decide the work that you're involved in, which of these 5 would you say your work is most closely related to in some way? If you're not working in this area, but you're here because you're fascinated by the topic, then if you could just tell your partner why you're fascinated in 1 or 2 of these particular principles. So if I just give you about 3 minutes now, just to have a quick chat to the person you're sitting next to. I won't ask you to talk about what you discussed, although clearly some of you were having quite deep conversation. But what I will ask you to do, if you could just have a show of hands. So who ended up talking? I mean, you can have more than one principle that you spoke about. Who found that they were talking about principle 1, number 1? Oh, okay. So our session may not be that busy tomorrow. Okay. Principle number 2. Okay. Great. Over there. Principle number 3. All right. Okay. Principle 4. 1 or 2. And principle 5. Marvelous. Great. Okay, so other than principle number 1, there was a handful of people for each principle there. So what I'm going to do now for the next 10 minutes is just try to, the word that Mike used this morning to talk about how we came up with the report was to synthesize all of the comments and observations and interesting things that we'd been told while we were doing the field work. So what I'm going to try to do to just establish what we thought some of the links were between language and resilience and which aspects of language are we talking about. I think we've heard the term language used an awful lot today, which is quite natural, but what parts of language are we referring to when we talk about resilience? So what I'll try to do is sort of unpick the threads of that synthesis and take us back to where we started, which was the data. And the way that I'm going to do that is just to show you a few comments from the people that we spoke to in the field work. So for each principle, I'll give you one illustration. So for the first one, this was quite a common comment. We learn about our language and our homeland in our Arabic literacy classes. We need to know about our identity for when we return home. So you can see why I've chosen that one. It's not so much about laying the foundations of literacy in the first language so that you can then transition to other languages, which is kind of where the research tells us the importance of L1 or first language literacy is. But it's very much related to identity and the kind of belongings that the people that we spoke to described to us. And the other feature of this that I thought was very telling was the fact that it was about returning home. So those trajectories are not one way. This was an Arabic literacy teacher in Turkey who had left Syria. Remember, this was 2 years ago. There's a lot of uncertainty around who will be returning to countries like Syria, when and how and if they will be returning. But clearly there's a role here for that kind of identity formation. And what we found was that people talked a lot about individual identity, but also about collective identities. And the more we kind of probed this type of comment, the more we found that those identities were then related to other identities. But clearly there was a role here for language, and we felt that we needed to establish what that link was. And that was why we chose to connect it to literacy, because there was something going on, not only in classrooms, but also very much on social media. A lot of young men and women, and older men and women, also talked about using social media to stay in touch with people back in Syria, or to stay in touch with people back at home from where they've been displaced. And so we saw that as literacy. You have to have a range of different abilities to read and write if you're going to be able to use your home language to stay in touch with people. Okay, so that was the first one. So you can see, hopefully you can see there, how we brought together home language with literacy, but also with identity. Now, the second part of that was, and several members of the panels throughout today have mentioned it, the link then to schooling and to economic opportunities. And we didn't really think those things were separate. If identity was about having some sense of belonging to a particular community, then that had to be recognized at school. So those kinds of identities had to be affirmed in classroom settings. And then the final dimension of this particular principle related to economic opportunities. So if those early literacies aren't in place, then finding yourself in a position where you can then gain the kind of qualifications that helps you access employment or further training will also sort of jeopardize those opportunities. So there's a lot in that principle, but we saw there was a lot of overlap between the different elements. The second, which was much, I think, clearer in terms of we're talking about language learning programs in languages such as Spanish or English or Arabic or Turkish, if you're a Syrian refugee in Turkey. So almost world languages that have an established set of different materials that you can draw on, different methodologies that we are fully aware of and that we can share with each other. So I'll give you a moment to just look at these comments. They were all from 2 teacher coordinators in a government-run high school in a poor part of Beirut. And they were really struggling. They were exhausted, as many teachers are. They were having to teach the Lebanese students in the morning and then do a double shift in the afternoon when the Syrian students would come in for their classes. They weren't getting paid any more money for doing this, and they had very few resources. So you can see how, under those very difficult circumstances, they feel pretty negative about the learners in the classroom. So this is not to criticize those teacher coordinators. They were amazing people. But you can see how they orient to a very deficit model of understanding the language learning sort of capacities of their Syrian students. So they talk about the culture being different. There was lots of shared cultural norms between the Syrian students who'd moved not very far to be in Lebanon, but the teachers felt there was a difference in culture there. They speak a different variety of Arabic, and this was another one of the reasons for choosing this particular set of comments, because it's not always about languages that are not mutually intelligible. They can be mutually intelligible, but language becomes a symbol of something else. Language becomes a symbol of difference. And in these comments, you can see how that frustration comes out through the way that these young learners are positioned. They felt that English teachers suffered the most because the textbooks weren't appropriate. But then at the bottom, a teacher in the same school, and I observed quite a lot of the classes in this school, and we saw a whole range, as you can imagine, a complete range of different feelings towards this massive influx of students. But this teacher at the bottom was very pleased that she discovered that she could use the Syrian varieties of Arabic with her Syrian students and the Lebanese varieties of Arabic with her students from Lebanon. And this allowed her to sort of, again, make the Syrian students feel a little bit more at home. There were other teachers who punished the Syrian students for using a different variety. So again, language becomes a marker for something else. And so the kind of access that we're talking about here clearly isn't as straightforward as it first seemed. Okay, the third one is about cohesion. I've chosen a very short quotation here. And it was actually from the same teacher coordinators from the previous slide, because at the end of this really rather negative interview, where they'd explained and tried to describe all of the frustrations that they were feeling with this massive teaching load, it was towards the end of the interview, they added this, that in the mornings, there are lots of Syrians in our classes. They know our culture because they've been here for 6 years. So there was this kind of real separating out of the recent influx of refugees after the current crisis, and the Syrians who had migrated more as kind of economic migrants 6 years previously. And 6 years is not a long time, it would seem, for people to have some kind of integration gone on here. So even though during the interview it felt rather depressing, when I look back at the data and you see comments like this, you think, well, clearly there's something else going on. And we thought that this was linked to resilience. This was a protective factor in the sense that when host communities and other communities come together to learn, there are opportunities there to learn about each other's culture. The fourth is about the effects of trauma. Now, we started off really talking about language and trauma from a different perspective. We tried to sort of look at the literature, which is within sort of psychotherapy, and looking at how psychotherapists understand how sometimes a second language can be used to talk in therapy about feelings and emotions that in a more familiar language would have been traumatic. So there is an existing literature here which told us that sometimes a second language, such as English in this context in the Middle East, English might be a way of building that kind of psychosocial support, but also for allowing people to talk about things that they may find more upsetting in a more familiar language. And I think this is quite a controversial way of tackling this particular one, but we had to tackle it simply because teachers were often at the front line of this kind of this situation where they're having to deal with all sorts of different types of adversity in the classroom setting. So one of the ways was the role that language can enhance resilience if it's a second language and it's in a sort of therapy kind of setting. And then there's this more specific role, which was where an actual intervention, a language learning program, can be a setting for psychosocial activities. Now, we're continuing to do some work. I'll talk about that just at the end. But we are continuing to look at future research that we need to carry out in order to find out more about how these principles work in practice, or how we can build on what people are doing practically to sort of make these principles work for particular language planners or for particular providers. And what we're trying to focus on is, what is the relationship between this psychosocial support and learning a new language? Again, I say it's controversial because there are very conflicting views on this. I'll give my email addresses on the end, so it would be interesting if you had any further questions or comments about any of the particular principles, then it would be great if you got in touch and told us if you were familiar with this kind of work. And the example that I wanted to show here is, rather than a quotation, it was from one of the Mercy Corps Kurdistan region of Iraq, adolescent, I think they're called adolescent-friendly spaces or safe spaces, where what you can see here is a drawing by a young man. The people on the left are ISIS. They are the bad guys. And they're using the flag of the Kurdish flag. Oh, sorry, the people on the left are the Peshmerga forces. They're the good guys. And there's this sort of symbolic use of the book and the page of the book, which is being used to crush ISIS, the bad guys. Now, it's a very sort of simplistic. You could read all sorts of different things into this. But what we saw was, in these language learning settings, different languages were being used. You've got the transliteration of the word book in Arabic. You've got some Arabic up on the top on the right, and you've also got a very sort of symbolic kind of use of the image of the book. But these were the kinds of activities, and these are the kinds of drawings that we saw in many of the classrooms. Okay, and the final principle is related to the strengthening of educational systems to create inclusive classrooms, and trying to identify a role for teacher education and teacher development. So this rather complicated quote probably wasn't the easiest quote to get a grip of here now, but this wasn't a language specialist. This whole interview amazed me because it wasn't a language professional. She wasn't a teacher. She was a health professional who was now working as a project manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council. But if you just take a moment to look, and you can see how she's familiarized with the linguistic context. And I think there's a huge amount that the state sector and the government sector, which is the sector that I've often worked on teacher education programs with, can learn from the NGO sector. There's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of knowledge, not just about how languages are used, but also how communities as diverse as this one, how they sort of operate together in a classroom setting. So she'd really got to the bottom of how these different varieties of Kurdish, which are all deeply politicized in that region, given the history of Iraq. But she'd really got to the bottom of how you provide a curriculum for these different ethnic groups, and how important language was. So I often end with this particular slide simply because it's one of the ones for me that shows how those differences between non-formal, informal, and formal are really only there. They're not that helpful. They don't help us to see what we can learn from each other. Okay, and that was the particular setting that she was describing, which is one of the camps in Kurdistan. So, just to end with what we're doing next, one of the activities that I'm involved in now with Mike and others at the British Council is the Language for Resilience Research Hub. So we're working on each of those 5 principles to try to find out what do we already know in that area, who's working in that area, what kind of resources are they drawing on, And what more do we need to know to make these quite practicable, to make these the kinds of, this kind of knowledge to distribute it. So we will then work on, I've put codes of practice in italics. It should have been in inverted commas because it's a sort of working title. But the idea that people have that knowledge, how do we share it? How do we tap into it? How do we let other people who are designing these programs, how do we let them know about it? When everybody, there's this tendency often to reinvent the wheel when it comes to sort of these kinds of programs, but how do we help people to tap into these different things? And so there's a final conference back in Zaatari refugee camp, I believe, in June on World Refugee Day, when we will be hopefully launching the reports. But my email address is there, so if you've got any further questions or any comments, please do get in touch. And thank you for listening.